Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston, Terminal Philosophy, Swithun Dobson, and we're here to talk about the Great Resignation, or what's been called the Great Resignation. And it's in a series of, it's primarily a way of talking about ratcheting labor shortages in the Western world, the United States, Western Europe, and even in places like China, where there is a vast lack of labor, skilled and unskilled labor in certain job areas. This while some people predicted it before COVID, such as Anthony Klotz, we also see that it was really during and after COVID that this started to go up. And some of the attempted explanations at this idea of the Great Resignation is, okay, why are people just quitting their jobs? One thing that people used to say for a while was, well, there's generous government welfare checks and COVID checks, and people don't want to go back to work. But that's starting to dry up now, and yet there still isn't the concomitant return to work. There were studies that were indicating that like 49% of workers said they just didn't want to go back to work. One thing that's interesting is they don't tell you the sex of those respondents, which I think tells you exactly what their sex is. Because if that was men who didn't want to go back to work, they would let you know that it was men that didn't want to work. And so when you look at the Great Resignation, there's a lot of things that I think go into it. And let's start from the top. I think a lot of people don't really understand what's going on. If we look at population statistics and demographics, is a graph. We see that it's beginning to look like an upside down pyramid where there's more people from the older generations than the younger generations. So there aren't enough people for the jobs that are available because not enough people were born. That's the first problem. And as boomers retire over the next 5 to 7 years throughout the Western world, we're going to see a rapid just vacuum of jobs. The jobs just can't be filled. Even if we had 100% employment with the the able-bodied population, there still wouldn't be enough people because there's more boomers than there are and Xers than there are millennials and Zoomers. There's a lot of people in what we might call the blue-collar jobs, trade jobs, that view themselves as being taken advantage of. They're not. Whenever wages rise in an economy, the people that tend to get it last are those that work in the service sector and those that work in blue collar jobs. And they're tired of seeing everything else go up except their wages. And so a lot of people are like, well, we're just not going to do this anymore. Another problem is that with a lot of these blue collar jobs and whatnot, there's a lot of on the job physical injuries that occur that people are far less likely to risk incurring anymore because they lack either the financial resources or confidence in the medical system to put themselves back together again if they have their back blown out or their knee blown out doing things like construction and drywall and all that stuff. We also see that people complain just about the hours they work. For example, we see in China the idea of the strategy of lying flat, where millennials are tired of the 996, working from 9 to 9, 6 days a week, and they're just gonna live this minimalist life and really not contribute much to the Chinese economy because they don't feel invested in it. They don't feel like they're getting properly rewarded for the work that they do. They're not being enfranchised. We also see that there are people that would rather just be at home because we've seen with COVID, with I think 2 or 3 months of people forced to stay at home. A lot of people are turning out, especially I think women are turning out that they want to stay at home. And we also have to keep this in mind with also the current legal troubles that Blizzard is having, because Blizzard is basically being sued out the nose for the sexual misconduct cases against them. And the question is, women who are seeing this in the news, there's the rape culture, 1 in 4 women are raped in college, all of this stuff we've been hearing about for years and years, the corporate executives, taking advancements on them. as well as the fact that just staying at home is easier. I think a lot of them are just going to want to stay at home because it's just less hassle, and they typically don't have to go back to work. Also, because of the upside down population pyramid, oftentimes millennial and Zoomer children can live with their parents because they only had one or two kids, and they have enough money saved up that they can stay at home. And with the rising cost of housing, for example, they can't move out and buy a new house because either due to increased demand due to immigration or prices growing because of speculation on the housing market and refinancing and all that. It's very difficult for them to move out, especially in light of how little they're getting paid. And so while there's a whole lot of interconnected issues that are feeding into the Great Resignation, but it's primarily a way of describing what's going on currently in the industrial first world, and even say China, which is like a second world now, of this gap between the demand for labor, which vastly exceeds supply, and people are rushing to figure out what explanation can they offer, which can then be used by these businesses, by the states, to fix this, if it is in fact something that can be fixed. I think what I'll end with before I pass it on to you, Keith, is I feel like what we're going through is a situation very similar to what happened after the Black Death. There's going to be a tremendous amount of population shortages, which we can get into why that's the case a little bit later, which is going to give those people that are able to work tremendous leverage to just sort of dictate terms of employment, much like the peasants did at the end of the Middle Ages, which ended feudalism because half of Europe's population had died in the Black Death. Keith.
Well, I think that there's probably a number of things that are feeding into this. So one of them is obviously the impact of the pandemic, because I think a lot of it was that you had people who were laid off or put out of work by the pandemic and decided they liked being out of work, that working really wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Now, it's been said that there are people trying to ride unemployment and things like that. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure there are people who would rather collect unemployment than go to work. But at the same time, I think there's probably a lot more to it than that. I think people have decided that they liked working at home, people who are working remotely, and not just people working lower skilled jobs, but people who had more professional level jobs. I suspect were starting to look for ways in which they could work remotely. Other people may have started doing something during the pandemic, like driving an Uber or something like that, and decided they liked being self-employed in the gig economy better than having a boss. There may have been some people who just decided their job just wasn't worth the effort, whatever it was. For example, let's say you have somebody who previously was working 30 hours a week at McDonald's, and then they were let go during the pandemic, and then when they're called back to work, maybe they just decided, I didn't really get paid that much there. I didn't really like that job. I'm just not going to go back. I've survived this long without it, so why do I need it? It's really not that important. Some people may have tried to acquire other skills that allow them to be more independent in terms of their work. For instance, during the pandemic, I know people who've actually done things like learn coding and stuff like that because they decide that they want to be able to freelance or work from remotely or things like this. And it's not just unskilled people, like people who work in fast food places that are not going back to work. There are skilled workers. First of all, to work remotely, you have to be some kind of skilled worker. You're not going to do service industry work over Zoom or something like that. But I know my brother owns a construction-related business, and those are skilled workers that work for him. They do interior design and that kind of stuff. But he's had trouble finding workers because a lot of his people just decided they just don't want to work. So for whatever reason, you do have people that are deciding they either just didn't like their job enough that it's not worth it to go back, or they found some other way of getting by without it. And it seems to have been a convergence of factors that have made this happen. I think one thing is simply that when it comes to service industry work, those places just don't pay very much. If you're working somewhere where you're making $8 an hour, and and a lot of those places don't even hire full-time workers anymore. So let's say you're working 28 hours a week for $8 an hour or whatever. I mean, a lot of people have probably just decided it's not worth it. They could go and uh, you know um, offer to mow somebody's lawn every week or something for whatever they would get paid working at McDonald's. So I suspect a lot of people have found alternative methods of making money, or they've joined the gig economy, or they're working underground under the table. I suspect there's also a correlation between the Great Resignation and the fact that murder rates have gone up during the pandemic. And the reason for that is I suspect there are more people participating in the illegal economy than there were previously. And whenever the illegal economy starts to proliferate, you see more murders, because the way that business is done in the illegal economy is if you have a business dispute, you don't go to court or sue somebody, you just shoot somebody. And I suspect that that's the reason, because we've heard an interesting criminologists have pointed out that during the pandemic, murder rates have increased, but a lot of other crime rates have actually gone down. For instance, a lot of routine property crimes have actually gone down. I think one reason for that is more people have been staying at home, so that people don't leave the house. So people are less likely to try to burglarize a house when there's people there. It's more dangerous. Um, but I also suspect that there's more people participating in the illegal economy, whether it's illegal drugs, whether it's illegal gambling, or other numbers running, and pimping, and all kinds of things that are done in the illegal economy. I suspect that's contributed to the increased homicide rates.
All right, Swithun.
Originally, my take on the sort of Great Resignation was mostly due to government sort of welfare programs. So you may or may not be aware, in England, they have what was called the furlough scheme, which is where if your employer kept you on the books, the government would basically pay for your entire salary. It was up to 80% or 100% on occasion for a good number of months. So you did have a lot of people who were officially employed, but were basically unemployed between the scheme only just finished in England in September of 2021 and was basically ran from March 2020. So obviously during that time period, you're not going to bother taking a new job unless it's particularly good, because basically you've been paid to do nothing. And of course, you had to go to work if they asked you to go in, but a lot of the sort of places of work closed, so you couldn't. Although, so in England at least, that only really stopped in September. So you could argue that 3 months isn't really that long to sort things out. Although it is noticeable that there are still significantly more adverts I see on the side of businesses now for hirings than I have seen before. So it's got to be something more than that. I think one aspect that was discussed earlier on during lockdowns was the fact that people hate commuting, and if they can work from home, they will. I mean, the longest commute I've ever done was 45 minutes, and that's because I cycled. If I drove, it would have taken me 20 minutes, as long as I've ever had. Whereas in England, pre-lockdown, people would travel up to 2 hours to go into London and 2 hours back, which is insane. And it's not surprising that people realize, you know what, I'd rather get up at 7:30 than 6 a.m. every morning and travel in with people I don't like and spend loads on train tickets, which are going to be loads of money. So people didn't really want to go back. Also, if from what I've read about the Great Resignation, the biggest resignation numbers have come between the 25 and 40-year-olds, who you probably predict are reasonably well skilled. The 25-year-olds probably less so, but probably the 30s plus. But not necessarily in executive positions or particularly high in the companies. So they're reasonably well skilled, and so they can, in many cases, work from home. And given how everyone's now used to working at home, people are used to using the internet for things they otherwise wouldn't have done, it's actually made working at home a lot easier. So, for instance, in my work in tutoring, people are now happy to do online tutoring, which previously, no, we're going to do it in person, they were used to it and they're happy. And so there's loads more you can do online, and people are happy to do it. So consequently, business has gone crazy for me. Sean Gabb had similar things as well. And so if you are relatively skilled, given the internet now, you could be going towards a more of a post-industrial economy in which self-employment, as Keith had mentioned, the gig economy, etc., is relatively much easier to do. I mean, the barriers to entry of setting yourself up independently now are a lot lower. And so you can do contract work, you can do various things and not basically be a wage slave. I remember a guy I know from my church. I think he's taken a contracted job now, but he liked being a contractor. He was a quantity surveyor because he basically just did what his contract told him he needed to do, and then he didn't do it. He just did a project and he left. Whereas if you work for a company, they make you do loads of stuff that isn't in your job descriptions, and you haven't agreed to do it. But basically, you end up just being a slave to the organization to do what the hell they want, because otherwise they fire you, even though that's not what you agreed to begin with. So, given the opportunity of not doing that, it's unsurprising that people have decided to take that. Now, another reason why they might not have done it, taking jobs, is I wouldn't be surprised for a lot of younger men, although this would probably be early 20s rather than mid, probably have decided that with apps and stuff, they can actually play the financial markets. I mean, GameStop is something that came to mind. You could do what the big hedge funds and other people do, but you could do it yourself. Now I know they're trying to clamp down on the little guy doing that. But given the amount of crazy money printing that took place in 2020 and 2021 and asset prices going up and things, it's not entirely surprising that people decide, well, we'll want some of that. And so instead, just go and play some of the markets instead, because they give you very, very high returns. And the share prices and things go. Why? Because you've got a massively inflationary environment. So again, not hugely surprising. As Todd mentioned, I would be very interested to see what the breakdown is of the how many of these 25 to 40-year-olds are women. The fact that they haven't said assiduously in every single article makes me conclude that with Todd that it's probably mostly female. And again, if it's between 25 and 40, again, that would make sense, especially over 30, because a certain clock goes tick, tick, tock. And if you don't have any babies at that point, you don't get any. Now, having looked at the birth rate figures, nothing has really happened yet. Birth rate's still going down. But that possibly is due to the lack of certainty. And again, this is probably a reason why people might not take a job, is they still don't know whether or not they will keep it or whether they'll just be laid off. Because if you may be aware, Europe is going insane. I mean, the UK is relatively sane at present, which is disturbing to say the least. Going to full lockdown again in Austria. Germany has instituted lockdown for the unclean, otherwise known as the unvaccinated. So why take a job in an industry in which you could be thrown out of a job again? You won't, especially in the service sector, especially if you decide to go after hospitality again. And again, related to lockdowns as to why they might have left, because during that time it's probably somewhat unpleasant because they had ridiculous protocols to follow constantly, and having lots of angry customers going, "Can I just buy something from you? Like we used to buy things from you? No. We've got to have like triple face mask behind 4-inch plexiglass, etc. Have to spray your eyes to make sure you don't spread the disease and stuff like that." So that probably annoyed them as well. It probably annoyed me. So there are lots of factors, but I do think increased numbers of self-employment and sort of contract work are probably here to stay, basically because people are used to using the internet now and they're not going to go back anytime soon.
Okay, German of philosophy.
Right. Well, these are all interesting points. I think we can probably all agree that this Great Resignation is it's generally a combined effect of various forces. I mean, it's not just any one thing. I think one of the bigger problems that I see is that productivity has not been close to matching wages for a long time, and wages started to stagnate sometime in the early 70s with the post World War II economy beginning to wane, and there's more international competition and the decline in manufacturing jobs and so on. And then now you sort of multiply those effects with various other things now in the era of COVID-19. And I mean, really, I think people are just quite worn down with low paying jobs in general. I think long hours and not enough money to, pursue your own hobbies or your own goals, or even have your own studio apartment, unless you work a second job. That's certainly one reason. One thing that I did read just recently before we started this stream is that more working, like younger blue collar working males, are starting to consolidate their living situation, meaning that more and more people are splitting apartments and houses. And I know that you have this in some major cities in the United States and in Europe where, you have like 10 people splitting an apartment, which, you're technically not allowed to do. You can split it with a few people, but not in these higher numbers. This is not a huge problem yet, but it is on the rise just due to COVID-19. And then I think, there is this sort of general malaise that is associated with these low skilled, low paying jobs. Working over, 50 or 60 hours and then having no prospect of having your own place, has this sort of depressing effect. And, with the pandemic ending, an untold amount of jobs that might have been a bit more dynamic pre-COVID-19. Unfortunately, there's been this large consolidation of corporate power in the United States where a lot of the wealth, I should say that when you lose a lot of these more smaller private businesses, the corporation will come in to fill that vacuum and that demand. And that has been happening on a very, very large scale. I work for Amazon and I do IT, and I can tell you that, just speaking with other people who worked there recently, they came from jobs where they owned a small business or a small shop, and it's just kind of a sad reality. They just can't compete with these larger entities, and so that's another problem. Is that I think there's also kind of a general depression in the workforce that you can't compete with these larger corporations. What I've noticed at work too is that there is, and what I've heard from a lot of area managers and so forth, is that there is just such an extremely high turnover rate. We have a lot of Hispanic workers from all over South America, particularly Venezuela, Colombia, you name it. And a lot of those folks just have a hard time staying around for more than a few months because, when I started there, I did the awful packing job where you're just in a long pack line with a lot of different people, and you're just you're filling packages and sending them down a conveyor belt. You stand in one place for 4 hours at a time, and it's just hard work, to be honest. And people are finding different jobs. Like what I have noticed is that a lot of people from South America prefer to do the delivery service for Amazon rather than fulfilling packages and things like that. And then also a lot of people are trying to do these like Uber Eats and DoorDash and things like that. People are looking for those types of jobs, but the problem with those is that you put all these miles on your car and the workload isn't consistent either. So if you want to pay rent by just doing those types of jobs, well, you have to be out on the road all the time. And so yeah, those are just some of the initial things I've mentioned, but I think you guys got to all the initial reasons for the Great Resignation to begin with. But I will say that, just from my own experience and just from talking to some people, I think a lot of people are just sort of worn down with low-paying jobs, and there has been this, this heightened interest in working from home too, because Keith and all of you guys mentioned that, after people were laid off, well, they kind of don't want to go back, for a lot of legitimate reasons. And so a lot of people are getting into coding and things like that. I think, I don't know. I think I'll just leave my initial comments at that.
Well, another important reason why a lot of people have quit is also vaccine mandates. Places like hospitals and schools and all of that stuff. They drove out workers because they didn't want to comply with the vaccine mandates, and that is creating an artificial scarcity for some of these larger areas. But what I think a lot of people are missing in this discussion of the Great Resignation is that they're missing the forest for the trees. So they're focusing on proximate causes. I mean, yes, the government shutdown was a part. Yes, the vaccine mandates were a part. Yes, people burned out at work is a part. But what is the underlying, for lack of a better word, civilizational pivot that's happening that nobody really wants to talk about, because it means that the Great Resignation isn't something that's going to be this short bump we get over, but is going to be this pivot for the rest of civilization, is drastic population decline. So beginning in around 2010, I would say, maybe even a little bit earlier, there was I did a lot of research on demographic studies, and Philip Longman, Nancy Cradle, Eric Kaufman, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, talk about this idea of massive population reduction, in part because of initiatives funded by the UN and national governments for population control. So beginning in the 60s, you had Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, the claim that, food production grows arithmetically, but human population grows geometrically. So therefore, we're going to have too many people, we can't feed them. And so all throughout the world, there were these pushes for limiting fertility. There's a lot of ways they did that, right? One is the feminists will always tell you, well, if you want to get women to not have children, send them to school, then have them get a career. Obviously feminine hygiene products, also abortion. And so overall, we've had each generation having fewer and fewer children from the boomers onward. And so what ends up happening is you just don't have enough people. And furthermore, because the boomers and many of the Xers had a lot of their money invested, for example, in the digital economy with the dot-com bubble, they lost a lot of money in 2001. They lost a lot of money in 2007 with the housing bubble. And then there was a crash again in 2020 due to the COVID-19 restrictions. And so for a millennial, you've been through 3 economic crashes. There's no way you're going to have resources saved up over that 20-year period, because you're just going to lose it all. And then but the boomers and the Xers didn't quit working because they couldn't retire, because they lost all their money as well, and they had to keep working. So you have this problem where the next generation didn't get the education they needed to be skilled laborers because the older generation didn't get out of the way. But the older generation didn't have enough children to replace them. So again, I think though the causes are completely different. This isn't some, bubonic plague that wipes everybody out, but due to various considerations of individual choices, government policy, UN policy, we're going to have this population bottleneck, which will create conditions similar to Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries as a result of the end of the Black Death. And I think in the same way that the Black Death and the labor shortages ended feudalism, the labor shortages that are going to develop are going to end globalism. Whatever follows afterwards is anyone's guess. But I think that in much the same way that the end of feudalism was facilitated by the labor shortages caused by the Black Death, the labor shortages caused by this current matrix of causes is going to lead to the end of globalism. Keith.
Yeah, well, on that note, with the talking about the end of globalization, Peter Zion, the economist and geopolitical theorist, has been talking about that lately. He's been talking about how the problems that we're seeing now with supply chains represent the fact that the global economy that emerged in the post-war Cold War period is now starting to crack up and fall apart, and we see that in terms of the problems we're having with inflation, where a lot of the problems with inflation can be traceable to the problems with the instability of the supply chains, and then that in turn reflects the fact that the global system is falling apart, in part because of the impact of the pandemic, where you had so many restrictions on travel and trade and things like that for a while, and it's still like that. I mean, you still have to go through a lot of uh, rigmarole in order to travel from one country to another now, with all of the different vaccine requirements and things like that. So it appears that what's going on is an acceleration of this process of deglobalization. In fact, a guy who gets a lot of negative mention and a lot of conspiratorial theories, Klaus Schwab, he's actually come out recently now and talked about the need to decentralize supply chains because of this, because of the fact that, well, to keep the global economy going, we can't be so dependent on these, very far-reaching supply chains. We've got to have a more localized system of distribution. And I think, though, that this trend was already developing before the pandemic, but the pandemic has definitely accelerated it quite a bit. And also in the United States, I think one thing we see, and it's probably happening in Europe as well, but very much in the United States, we're seeing the third worldization of the U.S. economy. Like I saw an article earlier today by Victor Davis Hanson, where he was comparing conditions now in American cities with those in third world cities. And he was talking about his travels to different third world cities where, like I know nowadays there's a concern about crime is escalating again. I mentioned that homicide rates are rising, but in a lot of the American cities, particularly on the West Coast, like in California and in Washington State and places like that, Seattle, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, you're starting to see massive populations of homeless people living on the street, and you're starting to see a lot of drug addicts that live on the street in these tent cities, and people who are basically professional vagrants, and as well as theft. Like I know lately there have been news reports about mob theft actions in stores in San Francisco and places like that. But one thing that Hansen pointed out in this article is that you see that all the time in third world countries. Like in third world countries, the norm is that the rich tend to wall themselves off in these gated communities and places that have special security and all that. And then crime, ironically, is viewed as sort of an intramural thing among the poor. So it's not taken nearly as seriously. In many ways, except for when there's a spillover effect, where it threatens people of privilege. And Hansen was pointing out we're starting to see that now in parts of the United States as well. So I've been saying for quite some time that the United States is developing a third world model society, in terms of our gap between rich and poor and and our social class system, and that's reflected in terms of living conditions where you have in poor third world countries, you have lots of people who live on the street. You have people that live in makeshift shanties and in vehicles and tents and where crime is an accepted norm in terms of how you make a living and things like that. We're starting to see those conditions develop in the United States as well. And I think the pandemic situation has definitely escalated that quite a bit.
All right, Swithun.
Todd, I think your point about demographics is interesting. It is certainly the case that we are in a situation whereby we'll end up with dependency ratios are going to be a lot higher than they have been historically, in particular the elderly, who are more expensive. I'd have to look. No, they will be. They're probably more expensive than children overall. The government expenditure. I'd have to check that. They might be close. But you're going to have a great proportion of the population who simply aren't particularly productive, but they're going to want to maintain particular levels of consumption. So what you might think that might end up leading to is just more imports and basically get the third world and everyone to make stuff that you can buy. That's possible, but given the fact that the US has run sort of a balance of trade, a trade deficit for so many years, the extent to which they're going to continue to buy sort of government debt and financial instruments in lieu overall and US dollars in payment for exports, their exports and the imports to the US, that's probably going to go down. So if you have a labor shortage, if you want to maintain current levels of consumption, you're going to really need to increase productivity. Now, whether or not that's going to go to the highest levels as you would need to sort of maintain the overall standard of living isn't obvious. I always, whenever I've mentioned labor shortages, I always just my immediate assumption was corporation complaining about labor shortages. Oh, they want more lax immigration controls. And I suspect that's going to be a bigger push from corporations in the next two years or so, going, oh no, we can't run, it's too expensive. These natives are too expensive. We need to get the Indians over, or we need to get the Venezuelans over, as a way of bolstering the labor force to keep wages at a sufficiently low level so they can continue their current business model and be profitable. Now, that is, of course, possible. And if they did that, that'd actually raise the wages in the third world to some extent. So to what extent that's going to happen is going to be various political factors. But if it is the case that they can't do that and there is a relative shortage, that is really going to improve the bargaining position of the average US and sort of European worker. Which will make things more interesting. Although that said, if the regulatory state becomes even more gigantic and intrusive, the ease of people setting themselves up independently being contractors could well become more difficult over time. And so this may be one of the long-term goals of sort of like digital identities and things to increase licensing, etc., to make sure that the large corporations still have workers because they have fewer opportunities to go elsewhere. In effect, the increase of the regulatory state would be the new version of the Enclosures Acts in the 18th century. Well, it started earlier in England, but 18th century, 19th century. Although when it does come to the birth rates, though, eventually the birth rates will go up. I think, as Eric Kaufman argues, that, or at least Edward Dutton following him, that eventually you'll get to a situation whereby basically only those genetically predisposed to have children will have children. And once that happens, you're not going to stop the birth rates. And so previously people who otherwise might not, or might genetically and have the environmental factors to make it so that they don't have to, won't have them. And then the people who are more genetically disposed to do so do. And then you're just going to get a large and continued increase in birth rate, which would be particularly interesting, especially if medical technology stays high, because the child mortality rate would be very low. And so you could have a massive population growth, although the question arises, how low does the population go beforehand? Keith mentioned Peter Zion. It was interesting. He argues that the Chinese have redid their population count, and basically, I think I remember right, they actually realized that their population actually already peaked in like the early 1990s, and it's actually now going down. Now, that's contrary to what I heard from other places, but it is certainly true that the People's Bank of China have now said that they should get rid of the two-child policy and encourage women to have more than 3 or more children, because the Chinese economy is simply not going to be sustainable having so many old people. And the big problem with that is once you've created a situation in which social status for women in China is based around working for a corporation, well, they want social status, and so that means they'll continue to work. It's going to be very difficult to change the culture in China so that social status for women over the age of 18 is actually having children and raising a family. If you do that, then you're going to get more kids. But trying to get that transition is going to be very difficult. Unless, of course, the Chinese just decide, well, forced impregnation or something like that. The Chinese could do that. But beyond that, like forced IVF, something like that. You could do that. But beyond that, I mean, it could work. I just think it'd be quite difficult. But the future demographics and sort of dependency ratios, etc., do make an interesting future, to put it mildly.
All right, turn on philosophy.
All right. Well, Keith brought up an interesting point with Peter Zion, where he has, in the recent past, identified various problems with the global supply chain system and globalism in general. And I had come across Peter Zion somewhat recently, actually, before the stream, and he said some interesting things about the United States and Europe and whether or not China will become a hegemonic juggernaut and so on. So based off of some of the things that he said and others like him, I think it's not an absurd prediction to say that economic nationalism will gain some popularity as a way of thwarting future supply chain issues. Now, obviously, nationalism means a lot of things to a lot of people, but as far as like a local or a nationalistic economic dependency, I think that will become more popular. And obviously, most nations can't produce everything they need in their own territory, so global trade will not disappear per se. I don't think it ever will, but the sole dependence on global trade, I think, could decrease because of all the problems that we've had with COVID-19. So I think that will be an interesting thing in some of the years to come here after we sort of make a recovery from COVID-19. But I don't know, the recovery seems to be very, very gradual. One of the interesting things you guys were talking about also was vaccine mandates. And just as kind of a funny sort of cultural anecdote, I've noticed that one thing that I want to say is that I've noticed that a lot of working class people of color are very turned off by vaccine mandates. Excuse me. On the Jimmy Dore show, regardless of what you might think of his politics, he has covered this quite a bit, to the extent of the low numbers of Black New Yorkers who are vaccinated. I think many working class people of color see this as sort of a kind of a pretentious sort of left-wing cultural battleground, and I think many of them are turned off by that. I think the mainstream media would have you believe that, well, it's just backwards rube Trump supporters that are just against vaccine mandates, but this actually is not the case. And I don't mean to use my daily job as some sort of hardline piece of evidence, but again, most of the people that I work with, a lot of the people from South America and some of the people from Africa, none of them are vaccinated. And what they've done at Amazon is that if you've received the vaccination, you don't have to wear a mask. But if you did not take the vaccine, then you do have to wear a mask. And it's me and the diversity gang who have not taken the vaccine, which is very interesting. So yeah, there's so many different abstractions that go into this Great Resignation, and I think one thing I'll say is that I think employers, because there's been such this incredible consolidation of corporate power, especially in America. I can't speak to Great Britain or other places in Europe, but at least within the United States, there's been this enormous consolidation of corporate power. They're going to have to decide how to they're going to have to decide how to manage their workforces better, because there won't be an endless stream of immigrants forever to sort of solve these labor shortages. Todd mentioned the book Eric Kaufman, which I think he wrote the book The Religious Shall Inherit the Earth. A lot of studies in demographics suggest that in about 40 years from now, the global population will start to decrease. And along with that, long before that, there won't be enough jobs for a lot of these migration patterns that you see from the Southern Hemisphere to the Northern Hemisphere. Sometimes we think, in terms of, the long-term historicity of Western influence across the world, we see, a lot of patterns moving from east to west in terms of immigration. wars and things like that. But now the axis has sort of shifted, and now there's a lot of economic opportunity in these northern hemisphere regions, and so you see all this immigration from Africa into Europe and the Middle East into Europe, and then South America into North America. However, I don't think that this will last because the global population will drop, eventually here in the coming decades, and there simply won't be enough jobs for everyone to go around. And so, I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that companies like Amazon and Walmart and Apple and all these large, I think you could say over these bloated corporate entities are going to have to reflect deeply on how they want to maintain their power. And if they want to maintain their power, then they should, they either need to consider matching wages with the productivity that those demands that they place upon the workforce, or they're going to have some sort of they might have some sort of French Revolution situation on their hands eventually. I don't think that that's just around the corner, but that's the direction that things are headed in. And the problem with things like companies like Amazon, there's all sorts of internal union busting functions that they have, and they pay people to kind of go incognito and spy on little union creation efforts. And so this simply just can't last forever, and they're going to have to start paying workers more money, and they're also going to have to give people the option to things like paid maternity leave or things like that, because if they just suck the soul out of you and they demand 40 plus hours every week and not much else, they're just going to have a problem on their hands. So I think you'll see several things. I think you'll see the potential for some instantiation of economic nationalism, and then you might see perhaps I won't hold my breath, but you might see some sort of half-baked enlightenment moment in corporate America, where the workforces might gain more of what they want: more money, more free time, better benefits. But I think they're going to try and retain their power and their influence for as long as they can before they give way to something like that.
Yeah, so I'll start with wrapping up with closing statements. But what I'll say is what I see the Great Resignation as being a sort of like prologue or first act to is the complete destruction of this globalist Bretton Woods post World War II framework, where basically what's happening is, since everybody is operating within this globalist technocratic system, operating with a false anthropology based on prisoner's dilemma and rational actors, there's like this whole shadow zone all over the world where people are acting like real people, but they're not acting like they're supposed to. They're not acting as little cogs in a machine for the global economy. They're not acting as quote unquote rational actors who think just like we do. We've seen the fallacy of this thinking with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And or to sort of paraphrase Baudrillard, the desert of the real is growing within the simulacrum until the simulacrum just becomes a tattered shred of nothingness. And what I think is that we're beginning to enter into that period where the simulacrum ends, and at least ends in this iteration, and then it's replaced by a, maybe not Mad Max, but a very decentralized, unstable future. Keith.
Well, I guess I would go back to my earlier point about the third worldization of the U.S. economy and U.S. society. I've had conversations about this with people that I have known from countries that are, I guess, considered lower, maybe not lower income, but maybe lower middle income countries, like, say, the Philippines or Haiti or somewhere like that. And they will often tell me that the way that their economy works, as far as the working class is concerned, is that a lot of people really don't want jobs because jobs just don't pay. Like, they'll say, well, if you get a job, say, working in a store, like their equivalent of a convenience store, whatever that would be, you might work, say, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, and in American money, your take home pay is going to be something like $300 a month, which is just really crummy wages, and people really just don't think it's worth their time. Instead, you have people that try to find other ways to make money, like selling fish, or buying and selling old clothes, or I guess the equivalent of what we would call a gig economy, and things like that. Also, you find people that move in with their families, or they never leave their family's home. It's more common to find multiple generations living in the same household and things like that. And more we're moving in that kind of direction. Like increasingly now, it's not uncommon for adults to be living with their parents, or older people to move in with their adult children or whatever. And that was rare in my day. Like when I was 20 years old, somebody that was 30 that lived with their parents was a loser. I mean, that's just the way it was viewed. Nowadays, that's just viewed as a matter of economic convenience, and I see the United States moving in that kind of direction as well. I've been predicting for over 20 years that the United States was going to be eventually developing a third world model of economy, sort of like I know some of the paleoconish type people call it the Brazilianization of America. But it's really just the kind of system now that you see, people like Joel Kotkin writing about, where we are developing this kind of third world class system with huge disparities between rich and poor, the poor are getting poorer, the middle class is shrinking, and the rich live as opulently as they ever have. But then we're starting to see more third world like conditions, and I think that's creeping into the labor force, where you have people who just don't want to work these crummy jobs. Also, I think that with that comes along a change in social mores. The United States for a long time had this kind of middle class oriented culture where being unemployed is considered shameful in some way, or there's this idea of the work ethic, like you should have a job, it's just the right thing to do, or something like that. And more I see that fading away too. People are like, oh, forget having a job, what is a job going to do for me? But that kind of thinking is more common in more traditional type economies, with the kind of poverty and class disparities and stuff, and working conditions that you find in those kinds of economies. So that seems to be where we're headed.
All right, Swithun.
I would say ultimately, you shouldn't have job shortages, and I'd be surprised if there's a situation where there were not enough jobs for people, on the basis that, well, given that people always kind of want more, there's always going to be something that they can do to satisfy a new want that previously wasn't being satisfied before. I mean, so for instance, if you were to look at the number of jobs that existed in the 19th century and look at the jobs now, I mean, you wouldn't have predicted three quarters, if not more, of the jobs that existed now that existed in the 19th century. So I'd ultimately say there's always going to be work for people, insofar as they're going to need to do something productive to earn money so that they can then buy things from somebody else, or at least they become self-sufficient. So I expect that has always happened. The question is, how much are they going to be able to earn? And so if we do get a situation where there are fewer people and the bargaining position of workers goes up, there's two options really. There's one is, well, there's these people who got a bargaining position. We're really not doing very well. The output's bad. Why? Because it's too difficult to legally set up a firm, and the barriers to entry are too high. So you deregulate and de-license and demonopolize, which then, I suppose, then improves even further the bargaining position of those people, but also then would increase the amount of output that would be produced. Or the other thing is to double down on, no, we do not like the peasants having bargaining position, and try to restrict their options so that they can then accept the lot that they had previously. My suspicion is they'll, at least in the short run, attempt the latter, as I mentioned earlier. And this will probably be done in the guise of health and safety. We need to make sure that everybody is healthy and clean And so we need regulation to keep the unclean away from the clean. And this would be a way of further cartelizing the economy and concentrating wealth. I mean, Keith pointed the article is it BlackRock, I think, that controls like an astonishing amount of huge firms and is massively powerful. I mean, that organization is not going to be one that goes, we're going to deregulate. I mean, related as well is they've brought back in mask mandates as of this week in shops in England, and it's almost like the large corporations gleefully put out a sign saying mask wearing in the shop is mandatory. It's almost as if they love them, which I suspect is because ultimately it's in their economic interest to do so with respect to restrictions. But it does seem that the large ones seem to be gleefully enforcing these things, whereas the small firms don't. But those are my big concluding thoughts.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I will just say that for now, the employment situation in first world industrial nations will probably, unfortunately, get worse before it improves. I think Keith and our friend, Right Ruminations, have brought up great points in past videos where the United States is just going to subject itself to this sort of Brazilification of the economy and society in general. Unfortunately, the corporations have the corporations of the world have the power to change much of this, but it's difficult to see the situation changing anytime soon. Swithun brought up an interesting point just recently where, as the population declines gradually over time, then there will be more working class, there will be more leverage on the part of the average worker. So that will be interesting to see how that changes the situation. It's really unfortunate to see the rise of companies like BlackRock, where they're basically buying up all these homes and turning the U.S. into some sort of society of renters. And so we're going to have to, there's going to be some sort of societal and economic, perhaps even some sort of interprofessional corporate backlash to all of this corporate consolidation. So we're going to see what the repercussions of that are. I think I'll keep it at that for now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Swithun Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Price of Flight podcast, signing off.